The courtroom was filled with whispers that morning. Reporters leaned forward, eager to capture the next viral headline. On the bench sat Judge Harold Blythe, a man infamous for his arrogance and razor-sharp tongue. He was the kind of judge who smirked when defendants cried and rolled his eyes at pleas for mercy. To him, weakness was a choice and humility was a flaw. Across the polished floor, the courtroom doors creaked open and a hush fell over the room. A man in a wheelchair entered slowly, his head slightly bowed, his hands trembling as he pushed himself forward. His clothes were simple, a faded blue shirt and dark trousers. The moment Judge Blythe saw him, he let out a faint chuckle, barely bothering to hide it. "Well," the judge said, tapping his gavel against the desk. "This should be interesting. Mr. Robert Hayes, correct? The man suing one of our wealthiest corporations for discrimination." Robert nodded, his voice quiet but steady. "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Blythe leaned back, smirking. "Tell me, Mr. Hayes, how exactly did they discriminate? Did they not give you a job because you were, well, less mobile?" The word less came out coated with disdain. A few people in the gallery exchanged uncomfortable glances. Robert met his gaze, his calm eyes hiding a flicker of something deeper. "They didn't deny me the job because of my wheelchair, sir," he said softly. "They humiliated me for it." The judge snorted. "Humiliated you? Or maybe you're just being too sensitive. The world doesn't owe anyone special treatment." Every word felt like a slap to Robert, but he didn't flinch. He simply looked down, fingers tightening around his lap blanket. In the audience, a young woman, his sister Emily, watched with anger burning behind her tears. When Robert began to explain how the company had mocked him, refused accommodations, and circulated cruel jokes about his condition, the judge interrupted again and again. "Maybe they were joking. You know how offices are. Perhaps you just didn't fit in." The arrogance in the judge's tone was unbearable. The lawyers on both sides exchanged awkward looks, but no one dared speak up. Judge Blythe was known for ending careers with a single gavel strike. But then, as Robert's testimony continued, something strange began to shift in the courtroom. His words weren't just about a job. They were about dignity, about how people see weakness and decide it defines a man. Each sentence carried quiet strength, a reminder that not every battle is fought standing tall. Still, the judge rolled his eyes. "This is a waste of time," he muttered. "Frankly, I'm starting to wonder if this whole case is just a sympathy act." That's when Robert finally lifted his gaze fully. His voice was calm, but it carried power now, a kind that silenced the murmurs. "Sympathy, Your Honor. I didn't come here for sympathy. I came here for truth, and by the end of this trial you'll see it, whether you want to or not." For a brief moment, the judge hesitated. There was something in Robert's tone that unsettled him, a quiet confidence that didn't match the image of a broken man, but his ego quickly took control again. "Fine," Judge Blythe said coldly. "Then show me your truth, Mr. Hayes. Let's see what kind of man hides behind that chair." As Robert wheeled himself back toward his table, Emily noticed the faintest smile tug at his lips. Not of amusement, but of purpose. She knew that smile. It was the one he wore when he had a plan. And whatever that plan was, it was about to shake Judge Blythe's entire world. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the courtroom through tall glass windows, painting long shadows across the polished floor. Reporters gathered again, cameras ready. The story of the disabled man versus the corporation had spread like wildfire. But what the audience didn't know was that this day would test more than just legal arguments. It would test character. Robert Hayes sat quietly at his table, his hands folded, eyes steady. Emily sat behind him, whispering prayers under her breath. On the other side, the corporation's lawyer, a smug man named Victor Dalton, adjusted his tie and gave Robert a pitying smile. "Mr. Hayes," he began, "you claim the company denied you a fair chance because of your disability, correct?" "Yes," Robert said calmly. "And yet," Victor continued, pacing in front of the jury, "you applied for a position that, Requires standing, moving heavy equipment, and inspecting warehouse floors. How did you expect to perform such tasks from that chair? Laughter rippled softly from the back benches. Judge Blythe didn't even raise his gavel to stop it. In fact, his lips twitched in a smirk. Good question, counselor, he said. Mr. Hayes, the court would also like to know your answer. Robert turned his wheelchair slightly to face the jury. His expression was calm but resolute. When I applied, I made it clear that I had specialized equipment that allows me to stand with support. The company agreed to provide basic accommodations, but when I arrived, they laughed. They called me a miracle mascot and said I was wasting their time. The laughter in the courtroom stopped. The words hung heavy in the air. Victor's smirk faltered for a moment before he pressed on. Perhaps there was a misunderstanding. There was no misunderstanding, Robert interrupted softly. I was told to roll out before I embarrass myself. For the first time, the room felt a shift, an uncomfortable silence as the truth cut through the arrogance. Emily clenched her fists, but the judge leaned forward unimpressed. Mr. Hayes, he said sharply, you seem to enjoy dramatizing your story. The court appreciates emotion, but facts win cases, not pity. Robert looked straight at him. Then you'll get both, Your Honor. Facts and truth. There was that quiet confidence again, the same one that had unsettled Judge Blythe yesterday. But the judge brushed it off, hiding his unease behind arrogance. When the cross-examination ended, the judge called for a short recess. As people left the courtroom, whispers filled the hallways. He's brave, I'll give him that, one reporter said. But that judge, he looks like he's enjoying this too much, another murmured. Emily leaned close to Robert. You should have seen his face, Rob. He doesn't believe a word you're saying. Robert smiled faintly. That's because he doesn't know who I am yet. Her brow furrowed. What do you mean? Robert looked out the window at the city skyline. I didn't tell you everything, Em. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to face this as an ordinary man, not as someone with a title. Emily's eyes widened. You mean? He nodded slightly. When the time's right, the truth will speak for itself. Back in the courtroom, Judge Blythe returned with the same smug authority. He struck his gavel once. All right, let's continue. I trust this charade will be over soon. But just as he spoke, the door opened again, and a man in a crisp black suit entered. He walked confidently toward Robert and whispered something in his ear. Robert nodded, his expression unreadable. The judge frowned. And who might this be? My representative, Robert said calmly. He'll be submitting a few additional documents. The man handed a sealed folder to the bailiff, who placed it on the judge's desk. Judge Blythe sighed impatiently and opened it, and the color drained slightly from his face as his eyes scanned the header. Inside was an official letterhead stamped with the seal of the National Judicial Ethics Council. Emily watched as the judge's hands trembled ever so slightly. He quickly cleared his throat. A complaint form? Filed against this court? He stammered. Robert's gaze didn't waver. Just a precaution, Your Honor, in case justice forgets its duty. A hush fell over the courtroom. For the first time, the arrogant judge had no words. He slammed his gavel down. We'll reconvene tomorrow, he barked before storming out. As the crowd began to disperse, Emily turned to Robert. What are you planning? He looked ahead, his tone low but steady. I'm planning to remind him that respect should never depend on status. And tomorrow he'll finally see who he's been mocking. The next morning, a storm brewed over the courthouse, dark clouds swirling like the tension building inside. Reporters swarmed the entrance, microphones flashing. Disabled man challenges arrogant judge? Blared across every local headline. But inside the courtroom, Judge Harold Blythe sat tighter than ever behind his bench, trying to hide the unease that had crept into his mind since yesterday's session. He couldn't stop thinking about that letter. The National Judicial Ethics Council, why would they be involved? And why would a man like Robert Hayes, an ordinary wheelchair-bound plaintiff, have access to them? Something didn't add up. When Robert rolled in, the judge's eyes followed him closely. "Mr. Hayes," he began stiffly, "before we proceed, would you care to explain yesterday's stunt?" Robert smiled politely. "No stunt, Your Honor, just ensuring fairness. After all, everyone deserves a fair trial, even those you underestimate." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. No one dared speak to Judge Blythe that way. The judge's face reddened, his pride stung. "Watch your tone, Mr. Hayes," he snapped. Robert nodded calmly. "Of course, Your Honor, but truth doesn't bend to tone." Emily's heart pounded in the back row. Her brother had always been calm, but this was something else. There was steel in his words, quiet authority beneath his gentleness. The defense attorney, Victor Dalton, quickly stood to shift attention. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence showing Mr. Hayes's inexperience. Clearly his condition makes him unfit." Robert's lawyer, an elderly man named Martin, cut him off. "Unfit? Counselor, are we debating capability or prejudice?" The courtroom went silent again. Every eye was on Robert, who watched the exchange quietly, his hands folded, his breathing steady. Then, for the first time since the case began, he spoke out of turn. "May I address the court, Your Honor?" Judge Blythe hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Briefly." Robert turned toward the gallery and then to the jury. His voice carried steady conviction. "When I applied to that company, I didn't ask for favors. I asked for opportunity. What I received instead was laughter. They didn't see my skills and only my chair. But I didn't come here today for revenge. I came to remind this court that dignity has no condition." The room was still. You could hear the ticking of the clock echoing against the marble walls. "And Your Honor," Robert added softly, locking eyes with the judge, "you of all people should know what dignity means." Something flickered in the judge's eyes. Recognition, maybe even guilt. He straightened his robe, his voice shaky. What exactly do you mean by that?" Robert paused. His gaze was calm, unflinching. 10 years ago, a case came through this very courtroom. A young public defender fought against a corrupt corporation accused of stealing workers' wages. That defender lost everything when a powerful judge sided with money instead of truth. That young lawyer disappeared from public record afterward. The judge froze. His fingers tightened around his gavel. "And you're suggesting?" Robert nodded slowly. "I'm not suggesting. I'm reminding. That young lawyer was my mentor, the man who taught me justice before I ever learned to walk again. And the judge who ruined him?" He leaned slightly forward. "Was you, Your Honor." The room exploded with murmurs. Reporters frantically scribbled notes. The judge's face turned pale. That's absurd. You have no proof." Robert's representative stood and handed over another sealed document. "We do, Your Honor. Records of the judicial review that was buried after that trial. Signatures, rulings, all under your name." The courtroom erupted again. Judge Blythe slammed his gavel. Silence. "This is an outrage!" But no one listened. The air was charged with truth, undeniable and heavy. Robert looked at him steadily. "I didn't come here to humiliate you, Judge Blythe. I came to give you the same chance you denied others, a chance to do the right thing." For the first time in his career, the judge had no words. His arrogance cracked, replaced by fear, not of losing power, but of facing his own reflection. As recess was called, reporters flooded the hallway with questions. Emily gripped Robert's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. "You never told me this was about more than your job." Robert smiled softly. "It was never about my job, Em. It's about truth, and showing him that even those he looked down on can rise higher than his pride ever could." The storm outside finally broke, thunder echoing through the courthouse, as if nature itself approved of the truth finally coming to light. The next day, the courtroom was so packed that people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The scandal had exploded overnight. Arrogant judge exposed by disabled plaintiff. The media camped outside the courthouse waiting for what was being called the trial that turned the gavel. Judge Harold Blythe entered the courtroom slower than usual. The confidence he once wore like armor had cracked. His eyes darted nervously between the gallery and Robert Hayes, who sat quietly in his wheelchair near the front. But there was something different about Robert today, something commanding. His posture was straighter, his gaze sharper, and beside him stood Martin holding a black folder embossed with a golden seal. The judge cleared his throat. "This court is now in session," he said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "Mr. Hayes, I assume you're ready to continue your performance." Robert didn't react to the insult. Instead, he turned calmly toward the spectators. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like permission to submit one final piece of evidence." The judge hesitated, but pride made him wave his hand dismissively. "Fine, make it quick." Martin opened the folder and handed several sheets to the bailiff, who delivered them to the bench. The judge's eyes scanned the pages, and suddenly his breath caught. The seal at the top wasn't from a local office. It was from the Federal Justice Integrity Bureau. His voice faltered. "But where did you get this?" Robert's tone remained even. "You'll find that document lists the name of the Bureau's newest internal affairs advisor, a man tasked with identifying corruption within the judiciary system." Judge Blythe's face drained of color. "And what does that have to do with this case?" Robert smiled faintly. "Everything, Your Honor, because that man is me." Gasps erupted from every corner of the courtroom. Cameras flashed. The judge froze, eyes wide in disbelief. Robert continued, his voice clear and firm. "I'm not just a man in a wheelchair suing for discrimination. I was sent here undercover to evaluate this court's integrity, to see whether justice here was still alive. And it didn't take long to find the answer." The judge's hands trembled. "You're lying!" he shouted, slamming his gavel. "This is manipulation. You can't just—" "I can," Robert interrupted gently, "and I have the clearance to prove it." Martin handed another document forward, the official appointment letter bearing Robert's signature and federal insignia. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. The arrogant mask Judge Blythe wore for years finally shattered. Robert's gaze softened, but his words cut deep. "You mocked me, Your Honor. You mocked my condition, my dignity, and my purpose. But the truth is, this was never about revenge. It was about perspective. You thought the wheelchair made me weak. You thought kindness was submission. But now you see, kindness can have power too." The judge leaned back, dazed. "Why me? Why test me?" Robert's voice was steady, compassionate even. "Because power without empathy is the first sign of corruption. You've forgotten what it means to serve justice. You see weakness as burden, not humanity." A single tear slipped from Emily's eye as she watched her brother reclaim the respect stolen from him, not through anger, but through grace. The jury stared, spellbound. Even Victor Dalton, the defense attorney, looked down ashamed. Robert wheeled forward a few inches. "When I lost my ability to walk, I thought my life was over. But I learned something. True strength isn't in how you stand. It's in how you rise after being pushed down." The words echoed like thunder in the quiet courtroom. The judge looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Not as a man in a chair, not as a plaintiff, but as someone he'd wronged with his pride. His voice was low when he spoke. "Mr. Hayes," Robert lifted a hand gently. "You don't need to apologize to me, Your Honor. You need to remember why you wear that robe, not for power, but for justice." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then the judge slowly removed his glasses, his face pale but softened. "This court will recess until tomorrow," he said weakly. As the bailiff called order, the spectators erupted into applause. Reporters rushed to the doors shouting Robert's name. Emily wrapped her arms around him, crying, "You did it, Rob. You really did it." He smiled faintly. "Not yet, Em. Tomorrow we finish this, not with pride, but with truth." And as they left the courtroom, the once arrogant judge sat motionless on his bench, haunted by the reflection of the man he'd ridiculed, the man who had come to save him from himself. The final day arrived with a calm unlike the days before. The storm had passed, but the air inside the courthouse still buzzed with anticipation. People filled every seat not just for a verdict, but for closure. Even the reporters who had come chasing scandal now seemed quieter, almost reverent. Judge Harold Blythe entered the courtroom with slower steps. His robe looked heavier than usual, as though burdened by the weight of shame. Gone was the arrogant smirk, the cold stare of superiority. In its place was something human, regret. Robert Hayes sat silently at his table, calm and composed. Emily sat behind him, hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes already glistening with pride. When the session began, Judge Blythe cleared his throat, his voice trembling slightly. This court has reviewed all evidence and testimony presented over the past week. He paused, taking a deep breath. Before I deliver judgment, I owe this courtroom something far more important than a ruling. Every camera turned toward him. He looked at Robert directly. Mr. Hayes, I failed you. I failed this court, and the oath I took to uphold justice without bias. I allowed arrogance to blind me, and for that I am deeply ashamed. A hush fell over the crowd. Reporters froze mid-note. It was the first time anyone had ever heard Judge Harold Blythe admit fault. Robert's eyes softened. It takes courage to see our own reflection, Your Honor. The judge nodded slowly. You came here not to humiliate me, but to teach me. And you succeeded. The wheelchair I mocked became the very symbol of strength I lacked. He turned to the courtroom. This case reminded me that justice isn't about power, and it's about compassion. And sometimes the people we look down upon are the ones standing tallest. The gallery erupted in applause, quickly hushed by the bailiff. The judge picked up his gavel, his voice steady now. Based on the evidence, I hereby rule in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Robert Hayes. The defendant corporation is ordered to issue full compensation, a public apology, and to revise its hiring policies to ensure inclusivity for all. The gavel struck. Bam. Echoing like a declaration of redemption, tears filled Emily's eyes. Reporters stood to capture the moment. But Robert didn't smile in triumph. Instead, he turned to the judge and said gently, Thank you, Your Honor, for remembering what justice means. The judge lowered his gaze. No, Mr. Hayes. Thank you for reminding me. After the session ended, the crowd surrounded Robert, praising his courage. But he quietly rolled toward the bench where the judge still sat lost in thought. Judge Blythe, he said softly, I didn't come here to destroy your reputation. I came because I once believed in you. The judge looked up, startled. You believed in me? Robert nodded. Years ago, when I studied law before the accident, I read your old rulings. The ones where you fought for the voiceless, stood against corruption, and refused bribes. You were my hero once. That's why I asked to evaluate your court. I wanted to see if the man I admired still existed. The judge's eyes glistened with tears. And what did you find? Robert smiled faintly. He's still there, just buried under pride, but he's finding his way back. The older man bowed his head, overcome with emotion. You've given me a second chance, Mr. Hayes. I won't waste it. Robert extended his hand. The judge hesitated, then stood slowly, his legs shaky, and took it. For the first time, it wasn't a handshake between authority and subordinate, but between equals, two men who had both learned the true meaning of strength. As Robert turned to leave, Emily whispered, You did it, Rob. You made him change. He smiled gently. No, Em, he chose to change. I just gave him the mirror. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers as Robert exited into the sunlight. Reporters shouted questions, but he raised his hand and said softly, Today isn't about headlines. It's about hope. If one man can unlearn arrogance, maybe others can too. And as he rolled forward, a soft wind lifted the flags above the courthouse, symbols of justice fluttering proudly again.